Greetings and welcome to week 3, lecture 3. In this lecture, I would like to explore 3 consistent themes that emerge biblically and within the Christian tradition, themes that I believe will sort of lead us into next week, 3 themes that I believe create the inroads to navigating the process of neighboring discussed in lecture 2 of this week. The process of seeing walls become boundary markers and boundary markers leading to erased lines. These 3 themes are mercy, empathy, and compassion. See, Christian neighboring, as I've mentioned in previous lectures, is not an attempt to form superficial, manipulative relationships so that those that we live in proximity with will eventually pray a prayer. Now, one's aspirations as a good newser, which is typically what I call the gift of evangelism, might always be to live and speak in such a way that as life is lived organic and in dynamic ways, that there are opportunities to express and share something that's held deeply in the core of who we are. I think that's where evangelism flows from the best. Likewise, if we'll neighbor well, the same opportunity must be afforded or must exist for the neighbor to share what they hold deeply in the core of who they are as well. Christian neighboring is the belief that even though no prayer is prayed, that somehow the kingdom is glimpsed when people share mutually edifying, reconciled spaces with one another. There's something pleasing to God when friendships are built and lives are shared with one another. Now, before going any further, I want to remind you from lecture 2 of this week, the biblical tensions that seem to suggest this tenuous space between resistance to the outsider and the embrace of the outsider's stranger, neighbor, friend, and ultimately brother or sister. But in doing so, we must look at the themes that I've already mentioned to make possible the movement of Christian neighboring. The first is the concept of mercy. Now, mercy is often understood as not giving to others what they deserve. This concept of mercy is premised on purely on an understanding of retributive justice. Not that there isn't warrant for such an understanding of mercy, especially in terms of the system of justice. And depending on the way in which you understand the sovereignty and justice of God, there might even be warrant of that in that definition. And Paul seems to tip his hat at that concept of mercy in Ephesians 2:3. All of us who lived among them at one time, gratifying the cravings of our flesh and following its desires and thoughts, like the rest, were by nature deserving of wrath. But because of his great love for us, God, who is rich in mercy, made us alive with Christ even when we were dead in transgressions. It's by grace you have been saved. Yet even in tipping the hat to this vision of mercy, he goes beyond it. Instead of simple pardon, mercy is the catalyst for possibility and life. It's the possibility of erasing the lines that separate and divide. It's the possibility of bringing together. And in this definition of mercy, grace and mercy are wrapped up inextricably. Mercy as the extension of possibility and the erasure of division, and grace as relational relocation, positing us with one another in meaningful and redemptive ways. This, for me, lay at the heart of the biblical understanding of mercy that Christians need to get a hold of if we're to neighbor well. When Paul says, we too were once like them, he's erasing the lines that so regularly divide sinner and saint, insider and outsider. Mercy becomes the possibility of recognizing the withness that we experience in light of God's grace that made room for us to cross the chasm and enter into a redemptive relationship with him. If we enter into a relationship with neighbor already standing in an us-them posture, we've failed to live in light of mercy. We've failed that if it had not been for God's redemptive purposes in Jesus Christ, I would not be able to claim an us in the sense of being morally superior or religiously righteous. But because God has, I can. And if we look throughout the Levitical laws of chapter 19, we see the emergence of mercy's reminder that relocates Israel in the presence of their enemies. An example of this is Leviticus 19:33. When a foreigner resides among you in the land, do not ill-treat them. The foreigner residing among you must be treated as your native born. Love them as yourself, for you were foreigners in Egypt, and I am the Lord your God. The neighborliness of Israel premised on the mercy of God and in extension, his grace, which reminds Israel that their place is because of God. Therefore, their place among others should live in light of the redemptive mercy of God. Now, mercy is about relocation. It's about reminding us that all relationships begin at the point of our withness and not our salvific difference. Failure to begin at the point of mercy already creates a religious chasm that will be felt in condescending behavior, in superiority in language, action, and religious ritual. What if we were to truly live in light of mercy? Every interaction with my neighbor begins with, I am in this with you. If there is any difference, it's only because I've been discovered by the very one that seeks you. Mercy begins to deconstruct the us-them that divides us. Empathy then takes it one step further. If mercy relocates us, then empathy repositions us. Empathy requires the capacity to get beyond ourselves and truly share space with another. Again, given the lectures that I shared last week, our tendency to see ourselves in light of rugged individualism, we often enter into relationships in a contractual way. We enter into a space being two individuals that voluntarily engage one another, often in a cost-benefit analysis. However, empathy moves toward the other by going beyond ourselves. There's something significant in Jesus' words when he says, love your neighbor as yourself. That statement is a reflection that to love well means that we've had to reckon with ourselves. We've got to love ourselves in light of God's love for us, living and embracing our belovedness from the Father. When this happens, we're no longer trapped in our insecurities, our measurements of what we deserve. We're no longer damaging and sabotaging those relationships based on cycles of dysfunction rooted in our identities that are always in flux. Instead, we've sought the healing of Jesus, rooted our identity in our belovedness, and refused blind extension of our dysfunctions. We move beyond ourselves. This is different than getting over yourselves. This is getting through ourselves so that we can go beyond ourselves, allowing ourselves to be moved into a space of empathetic presence, the capacity to take someone into our lives. If mercy relocates, empathy repositions, placing us in an often lonely shoes of our neighbor, helping us, enabling us to adjust our perspectives, seeing and feeling the world from their place. This isn't a place that we can leap. It requires an invitation. It requires a space of hospitality where they are the host and we are the guest. It comes as the walls become boundary markers and the boundary markers become erased lines. As this space is made, we are afforded the opportunity for deep and meaningful presence. If mercy erases the temporal spaces of division, empathy moves us from stranger alien to neighbor and ultimately friend, drawing us closer to what we've suggested in previous lectures to be the movement to sister brother. Mercy relocates, empathy repositions, compassion lives in redistribution. Allow me a moment to explain. In the political discourse of this day, redistribution is understood within the categories of politics, which means socialism. However, in reading about the early church, redistribution was the natural extension of the community who was moved by intimate connections with one another and sought to live out compassion through the kind of faithful care that attended well to the needs of others around them. Empathy repositions us, moves us beyond us, and in entering into the other by invitation from the other, we ought to expect to be moved by the other. Now, compassion in the Hebrew has this connotation of this deep movement into the womb of a person. In Greek, its connotation is this move down to the bowels, the seat where the emotions are located. Listen how this plays out in the early church in Acts chapter 4. All the believers were one in heart and mind. No one claimed that any of their possessions was their own, but they shared everything that they had. With great power, the apostles continued to testify to the resurrection of Lord Jesus. And God's grace was so powerfully at work in all of them that there was no needy person among them. For from time to time, those who owned land and houses sold them, brought the money from their sales and put it at the apostles' feet, and it was distributed to anyone who had need. Joseph, a Levite from Cyprus, whom the apostles called Barnabas, which means son of encouragement, sold a field, owned, and brought the money and put it at the apostles' feet. Or in 1 John 3:16, it says this is how we know what love is. Jesus Christ laid down his life for us, and we ought to lay down our lives for our brothers and sisters. If anyone has material possession and sees a brother or sister in need but has no pity on them, How can the love of God be in that person? Dear children, let us not love with words or speech, but with actions and in truth. Compassion is neighboring in action. Having stepped beyond the barriers into this redemptively reconciled space, having seen and felt the world from their perspective, we now live lives in light of what we discover there, the needs there. We redistribute our time, our emotional availability, and yes, our resources in light of what we discover through our empathy. I've witnessed this in powerful ways in poorer communities that I've been a part of. Poorer neighbors are often more prone to share their resources, extend a couch for someone to sleep on, etc. But now understand that there's often relational dysfunctions that come with that. But the extension of compassion in light of knowing what they're going through should be a challenge to the church. These three themes we discover in Jesus and through the church, mercy, compassion, and empathy, often set us up for the potential of neighboring and moves us into next week's lessons.